Hi, I'm Jason Brodsky,
And I'm Sarah Whistler.
and this is our presentation on anti-globalization movements. So I'm from Harrison, New York, and currently I'm a graduating senior at Indiana University through the Kelley School of Business. I'm majoring in accounting and finance, and next year I will be a grad student for the MSA program, which is an accounting master's. I hope to work in public accounting for 2 years after that, and then I want to go back to grad school for an MBA in finance.
I am from Granger, Indiana. I'm a graduating senior, majoring in political science. I'll be in Bloomington for 1 year after this, taking some time off and hopefully working for a not for profit. I then want to go to law school and want to go into corporate law later in life.
So today we're going to be interviewing Sarah Whistler on globalization and anti-globalization. Sarah, please define globalization and anti-globalization.
Well, basically, globalization, it's kind of hard to get a set definition on it. People have thrown out words such as internationalization and economic interdependence, which information technology is often cited as the driving force between this interdependence. People and businesses being able to communicate worldwide. Thomas Friedman, he's big man for globalization, said that for his definition that it's the loose combination of free trade agreements, the internet, and the integration of financial markets that is erasing borders and uniting the world into a single, lucrative, but brutally competitive marketplace. And then anti-globalization is basically the movement to counter the trend of globalization and its harmful effects and to reform unbridled capitalism. People basically don't want this interdependence throughout the economy and stuff like that. There are a couple different arguments as to why people are joining this anti-globalization movement. Um, Many of them focus on markets and their failures, or what we would call a market creep, which is markets moving into areas in which they are not wanted. And then there's some with intellectual property, labor concerns, environmental concerns, the government's mismanaging the globalization efforts, and then there's also some issues with national identity.
So Sarah, can you explain further the concept of market failures and market creep?
Market failures are most often in correlation with multinational corporations. Basically, with market failures, people are finding that these big MNCs are having way too much political power, and they are influencing governments of all kinds and all over the world more than the actual people are. It's a place generally where competition ends and market power begins, and the government has to take. Basically, what's needed to happen is that the government needs to take over and curb the excesses of companies which are becoming too powerful. And the growth of MNCs has made national economies no longer governable, and so basically big businesses are gaining way too much power, and governments and the people are losing it. And then market creeps. One of the biggest problems, the idea of democracy is being replaced by market-driven ideals. Um, Corporations are having way too much power. And there's Lady Nina Hertz. She wrote The Silent Takeover, and she basically says that corporations have become behemoths, global giants, and they wield immense political power. And they, through this, they take away justice, equity, rights, and the environment, and issues of national security fall by the wayside. And she also goes on to say that foreign policy was determined and military actions were taken for the benefit of large corporations and not for the people anymore. And the anti-globalization movement is an agreement that that economics is not the measuring stick which should be used. Issues such as democracy and human rights or moral issues in corporations are being basically the corporations are being apathetic to all of these issues, and they just kind of do what they want to make money, and they don't care about the people. And there's also another well-known economist, Amartya Sen, says that the development, a concept often tied hand in hand with globalization, should be measured in terms of human freedom rather than in traditional methods like gross domestic product or other economic terms. He argues that democracy and civil rights should be a primary unit of measurement of development rather than being described as in some way distinct from development.
Sarah, what elements of intellectual property do anti-globalization activists dislike?
And the problems that anti-globalization activists have with it are pretty vast. Those who focus on the issue of intellectual property and globalization argue that over time patents and intellectual property rights have been made broader in their interpretation. And basically, this means that the intellectual property is being more and more protected. One author states, David Bollier cites 5 reasons why this is not a good thing. The first is that the public's assets and revenue streams are privatized, with only fractional benefits accruing to the public in return. Second, generally it is large companies who market are able to enclose and market concentration is increased. Third, this enclosure favors short-term exploitation over long-term stewardship of the environment. Fourth, enclosure can impose new limits on citizen rights. And then finally, enclosure frequently imposes market values in realms that should be free from commodification. Another problem with that people have is that the element of IP rights is that they grant a monopoly on items they protect, giving market power to the owning institution. Basically, this monopoly allows the rights holder to recoup the cost of creating the intellectual property, and without those rights, firms would have no incentive to research and create intellectual property. Most economists agree that a monopoly is necessary to provide incentives to the IP creators, but when human rights are involved, the rules should obviously be different. An example of this is back in 1995 during the Uruguay round of talks. Uh, they were talking about the Western pharmaceutical companies being able to have a patent so that they wouldn't have to create generic brands of drugs. And this how great for the companies because they could make more money was awful for all the people with the diseases, especially in the third world countries, because they would not be able to afford the medications necessary. And so this is just showing how globalization is clearly helping out the big corporations and not the people of the world. And it's also argued that patents are being created for items or ideas which should not be able to be patented. Businesses are having frivolous patents that some examples are Amazon's patent on the one-click purchasing system, and also things are being patented in third world countries like basmati rice in Thailand. It, the rice has been used by people all of Thailand for generations and generations, and they're trying to patent a certain type, and brings up the question: Is it really can things that individuals or companies claim ownership of something that has been used for hundreds and hundreds of years? And according to the trade-related aspects of intellectual property or TRIPS agreement, this is completely okay. And critics are arguing that these agreements are being created to favor the MNCs instead of the people. And under these agreements, countries which do not adopt the standards allowing for private ownership of plants and microorganisms can face trade sanctions.
You mentioned labor issues. What are those, and are people losing jobs?
Yes, people are definitely losing lots of jobs. According to the International Forum on globalization has been, quote, characterized as a sharp increase in unemployment in both the North and the South as corporate activity becomes more mobile, unrestricted, opaque, and unaccountable, end quote. There's several instances throughout globalization that increase unemployment. An example is with the Washington Consensus. There's a strong bias against state-owned enterprises, and developing countries are often urged to privatize those businesses. And throughout this privatization, there are a lack of unions that are protecting all of the people, and so the companies they are often firing people in order to become more efficient in getting rid of long-time employees so they don't have to pay them out benefits whenever they retire. And so also the International Forum on Globalization cites that, quote, massive population shifts from rural to urban areas with commensurate poverty, famine, ethnic friction, and degradation of living and working conditions and human rights, end quote. Basically, MNCs are creating their businesses in high urban areas, and so the population shifts from the rural areas to the urban areas, and then disease and everything is more centered and so spreading, and the standard of living is just going down and down in these third world countries. The problem with this is that however these are global issues, they're dealt with on a very national level. There are no international guidelines for the labor issues. An example is the maquiladoras in the U.S. and Mexican border. The U.S. is allowed to go in and create factories that the Mexican people can work at, but since Mexico has a lower standard of living, they don't have as high of wage rates as the U.S. does, so they are just continually being pushed down and by the MNC.
When talking about the environment, people generally focus on global warming. What are the arguments anti-globalists have concerning it?
Basically, as companies are sidelining the people of the world, they're also disregarding the environment and all of the different laws that are created in countries like the United States or other Western countries, and they will just take their company and move to a third world nation where there are no laws, and so they don't have to have expensive environmental safeguards, and so they're putting out pollution that is hurting our ozone layer and creating greenhouse gases. Another argument for this is that as trade increases, transportation infrastructure has to expand. So we're continually building more roads and tearing down the trees, as well as there are increased fuel use and from planes and ships and cars and such traveling everywhere. Another argument is that it deals with bio invasions, and this is basically that as the goods and services and people move back and forth from taking all of the goods place to place, they are also bringing with them microorganisms and different um, diseases from place to place, and people that are not used to these cannot deal with them, or even the environment can't deal with them. And then the final argument, as far as the environment goes, is that with increasing specialization comes increasing concentration. Basically, this is taking it takes small scale farms and making them big scale farms, and so they're using more chemicals on the farms, and this is a considerable pollution than what small single farm owners would have.
So, after hearing of many reasons anti-globalization activists have, what is the overarching message to take away from all of this?
Basically, globalization and a lack of governmental control leads to diminishing human rights and environmental uh, rights. Uh, as information and technology become cheaper, and then transportation increases, the power of money and the ideas of market fundamentalism are overstepping the ideas of inalienable rights and human rights, which everybody is entitled to. And these problems, I guess, don't really involve the fundamentals of globalization. It's more how the government is controlling them or actually not controlling them. Globalization could be a great tool in increasing world connectedness and helping people get jobs and higher pay increases, but the governments are not able to handle it yet. And so until governments are able to do this, globalization should just not be in effect.
So, Sarah, can you explain this next slide for us?
In 1999, the World Trade Organization held a conference in Seattle to discuss an important round of trade negotiations. On November 30th in 1999, the negotiations were quickly overshadowed by massive and controversial street protests outside the hotels and the Washington State Convention and Trade Center, in what became the second phase of the anti-globalization movement in the United States. The level of demonstrations was larger than other previous protests the United States had ever seen against a world meeting of globalization organizations. The control of the intersections by the protesters, plus the sheer numbers of protesters in the area, prevented delegates from getting delegates from getting to their hotels to the convention center. The police, who had formed around the convention center, were cut off from the rest of the city. The police were eventually overwhelmed by the mass of protesters downtown, including many who had chained themselves together and were blocking intersections. Violent confrontation occurred the evening of November 30th when police pursued protesters fleeing from downtown into the Bohemian neighborhood of Capitol Hill, using tear gas, pepper spray, and physical force. 600 people were arrested on November 30th.